Montana Territory. 1873, the wind had teeth that night, rolling down off the Bitterroot Mountains and cutting through the valley like it meant to take something. Jacob Bellamy reined in his gelding just past the bend in the trail, where the cluster of wagon fires still burned low against the dark. He had not planned to stop. He had supplies, a rifle, and 15 more miles before his next delivery. But then he saw her alone by the fire, shoulders drawn tight under a thin shawl, staring into the flames like they were the only thing keeping her in one piece. No other wagons nearby. No voices. No movement, just her. And the wind. Jacob swung down from his horse. She looked up as he approached, face pale against the firelight, eyes wary but dry. Not a woman who cried easy. "You all right, ma'am?" Jacob asked, voice low but clear, her hands tightened around the mug in her lap. "Wagon broke an axle 2 days back. My uncle went to find help. He did not come back." Jacob looked around the quiet clearing. There were signs of a camp, 2 barrels, a bucket, a pile of supplies, but no other people. "You been here alone since then?" She nodded. "My name is Maribeth Price." He gave a slow nod back. "Jacob Bellamy." He glanced toward the fire, then the sky. "It's going to get colder before sunup. You got a bedroll?" "No," she said, her voice steady, but something in her eyes flickered. "Just this." She held the shawl tighter. Jacob pulled his blanket from his saddlebag. It was worn but thick, and he had another. He crouched down and held it out to her. "Take this." "I could not." "I did not ask if you could. I said take it." She looked at him a moment longer, then reached out and took the blanket with both hands. He stayed near the fire, not too close, just enough so she would not feel watched. She wrapped herself up, tucked her legs under, and leaned closer to the heat. "You got family traveling with you?" he asked after a while. "My uncle and aunt. We joined a wagon train heading toward Deer Lodge. Then my uncle wanted to take a shortcut. He thought we could shave off a day." Her voice faltered just for a breath. "My aunt died of fever last week. We buried her 2 days before the axle snapped." Jacob looked into the fire. "You have any kin past Deer Lodge?" "No. I was supposed to work at a boarding house there. My uncle said it would be a fresh start." Jacob nodded slowly. He had heard those words before. They sat quiet for a long while, the wind whistling low through the scrub, the fire snapping like it had its own thoughts. Jacob stood and added another log. She watched him. "Why did you stop?" He met her gaze. "Because I saw a woman alone by a fire, and I do not ride past that." Her mouth pressed into a line, but her eyes softened. "You always ride alone, most of the time." "Why?" He looked down at his boots, then back up at her. "Because I never found a reason not to." She held his eyes. "Maybe you were not looking in the right places." He gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Maybe." That night Jacob slept near the fire, close enough to hear her breathe, far enough to give her peace. He kept his rifle beside him, boots on, hat pulled low. The cold pressed in, but he did not feel it much. At dawn she was still asleep, curled in the blanket he had given her. Her face looked younger in the light, fragile but not weak, worn but not broken. He set coffee to boil and fed the fire. When she stirred, he handed her the tin cup without a word. She took it, nodded thanks, and drank. "Your uncle's not coming back," Jacob said gently. "I know. I can take you to Deer Lodge." She looked up sharply. "Why would you?" "Because you cannot stay here, and because I do not like leaving folks behind." She stared at him long and hard. "You do not know me." "No, but I would like to." Her fingers tightened on the cup. "I will ride beside you," he said. "You do not owe me anything, but I have work up that way and you need a way out of here." She stood slowly, the blanket still wrapped around her. "Then I will ride with you." They left the fire behind at mid-morning. Jacob helped her onto his horse, then tied the rest of the supplies to the back. She held tight as they rode, her arms around his waist, her head against his back. She did not speak for a while, but he could feel her breathing ease. By the time they made camp that night, she was smiling. He cooked beans and bread over the fire, and she laughed when he dropped the spoon into the pot. It was not loud, but it was real. "We are not strangers anymore," she said, sitting close to him. "No," Jacob said, watching her face. "We are not." She reached for the blanket he had given her, then looked at him. "Will you sit by me?" He did. She leaned into his side, and he let her. The fire burned low, and the wind was quiet that night. Jacob looked down at her, her cheek resting against his shoulder, and something in him shifted. He had carried his life alone for a long time, never shared more than a night or a name. But now, with her beside him, he felt something different, not just warmth, hope. And he was not about to let it slip away. The third day on the trail brought hail just past midday, small sharp stones of ice that struck the earth like nails from a shaken sky. Jacob nudged the horse off the main track toward a stand of cottonwoods, Maribeth's arms tightening at his middle as they ducked beneath the low, green canopy. He dismounted first, then helped her down slow. She landed light but winced as her boots sank into the wet roots. "You favoring that right foot?" he asked, glancing down. "It turned some when I jumped from the wagon," she replied, brushing her skirt smooth. "I thought it would ease up. It hasn't." "No." He nodded once, then led the horse to a patch of dry grass under the thickest tree. Maribeth sat on a flat stone, rain slicking the edge of her bodice, but she didn't complain. She watched Jacob unpack a strip of cloth from his saddlebag and kneel before her. "I can wrap it myself," she said, voice quiet. "You could," he said, beginning to wind the cloth gently around her ankle. "But I'm already here." She lowered her gaze as he worked. "You're careful." "I've broken more than I care to count, learned what helps." Her mouth tugged upward, not a smile, not quite, but something softer than before. The storm passed quick, as Montana storms sometimes did, leaving the air thick and smelling of moss and lightning. They rode on, slower now, Jacob walking beside the horse to spare her the jarring. The silence between them had changed, not tighter but deeper, like a well dug past the first layer of earth. That night, they camped near a creek that ran cold and fast between stones. Jacob caught 2 small trout with a line of horsehair and a bent nail. Maribeth cleaned them without flinching, hands sure despite the chill. "You asked if I had family past Deer Lodge," she said as she turned the fish over the fire. "My mother was born there. She died when I was 8. Jacob looked over, his face unreadable. "Your father," gone before I could remember his voice. She poked the fire gently with a stick. "My uncle took me in. He wasn't cruel, just tired of everything. My aunt, she tried, but she was sick a long time." Jacob didn't offer pity. He just listened, his hands still, his eyes steady. "I used to think maybe I'd marry someone with a bit of land," she said. "Not because I wanted the land, just the steadiness of it, a place that didn't move." He nodded slowly. "You ever find someone like that?" She shook her head. No one ever stayed long enough to ask. The trout hissed in the pan, and the scent of it drifted up with the smoke. Jacob passed her a tin plate, then took one for himself. "I had a brother," he said after a while. "Older by 4 years. He fought in the war, came back wrong in the head. Didn't last long after." Maribeth glanced at him but said nothing. "My mother couldn't take the weight of it. My father drank himself sideways trying to." She reached out and set her hand lightly over his. He didn't pull away. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't press or demand. When the fire burned down, Maribeth leaned back on her elbows and looked up at the stars between the branches. "You always sleep with your boots on?" she asked. "Only when I think I might have to move fast." "Do you think that tonight?" "No," he said, and after a moment pulled them off. She rolled onto her side, facing the fire, her voice low. "I can't remember the last time I felt safe." Jacob stirred the embers once with a stick, then let it fall. "You are now." She didn't answer, but he saw her shoulders ease. When the sky turned pale and the birds began to stir, he found her sitting by the water, her braid half undone, her dress damp at the hem. She didn't turn when he stepped close. "I dreamed last night," she said. "I was hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees. There was a cabin behind me. I could hear someone chopping wood. Sounded peaceful," he said. It was. She looked over her shoulder at him, the sun brushing the edge of her cheek. "Was it your cabin?" he asked. "I think it might have been ours." He didn't speak, just stepped beside her and looked out over the creek. She reached for his hand, and this time she didn't let go. The trail bent eastward 2 days later, following a low ridge that overlooked a stretch of pine and river flats dappled with meltwater. Jacob pointed to a narrow valley below, where smoke lifted steady from a chimney tucked behind a stand of spruce. "That's the McAllen place," he said. "Been trading with them a few years now. They run cattle and breed mules. Honest folks." Maribeth adjusted the brim of her borrowed hat, her eyes following the smoke. "Will they mind us stopping? They'll ask what we need, not why we came." The path down was steep in places, and Jacob walked beside the horse again, one hand on the reins, the other steady at Maribeth's knee. She didn't speak, not since they'd broken camp, but her hand had brushed his when she climbed into the saddle, and she hadn't pulled back. At the homestead, a boy of about 12 stepped from the barn with a pitchfork in hand, squinting into the light. He called out, and a woman emerged from the porch, wiping flour from her hands. She was broad-shouldered and sun-browned, wearing a checked apron and a rifle slung across her back like it belonged there. "Jacob Bellamy," she said, stepping down the porch steps. "I see you brought company." "She's with me," Jacob said. "Name's Maribeth. We're heading to Deer Lodge. Thought we'd stop for a spell if there's room." "Always room," the woman said. She looked Maribeth over with a nod of approval. "You hungry?" Maribeth answered with a quiet, "Yes, ma'am." Inside, the cabin was warm with bread smell and wood smoke. A baby slept in a basket near the hearth, and the woman, who introduced herself as Ruth McAllen, handed Maribeth a bowl of stew without ceremony. "You got the look of someone who's been sleeping on rocks," Ruth said. "You ride long with this one." "Not long," Maribeth said, glancing toward Jacob, "but far enough." Jacob didn't sit. He leaned near the window, watching the yard without seeming to. When Ruth stepped outside to check the chickens and the boy returned to the barn, Maribeth set her spoon down and turned toward him. "You always carry that rifle like it's part of your arm." Jacob's mouth twitched. "Habit. What made you start?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, there was a time I didn't carry anything at all. Thought I could talk my way out of trouble. Found out I couldn't." She studied the lines around his eyes. "You ever wish things had gone different most days," he said. "But wishing don't change a thing." Maribeth folded her hands in her lap. "I used to think I'd end up alone, not because I wanted to. It just always seemed to be the way of things." Jacob looked at her then, really looked. "You're not alone anymore." He said it like a fact, not a promise. And that mattered more. They stayed the night in the McAllen barn, just above the stalls where the air stayed warm from the animals. Ruth had offered the spare bed, but Maribeth had shaken her head gently. "I'd rather stay close to him," she'd said, and Ruth had answered just as plainly, "Then take blankets and mind the lantern." Up in the loft, Jacob laid out their bedrolls side by side. He didn't touch her, didn't speak when she lay down beside him, their shoulders nearly brushing. The lantern flickered low, shadows drawing long across the hay. "I kept that shawl," she said softly. "I know. I think I'll keep it always." They lay in silence after that, not the uncertain kind, but the kind that held something growing just beneath it. In the morning, Ruth handed them a tin of dried apples and a small sack of cornmeal. "For the road," she said. "You'll make Deer Lodge by dusk tomorrow if you cut through the pass." Jacob tipped his hat. "Much obliged." Ruth looked from one to the other, then gave a small nod. "You're not like most men, Bellamy." "I don't aim to be." They rode out slow, the sun rising behind them, casting gold across the frost-laced grass. Maribeth didn't speak for a while, but her hand rested easy on his hip as the horse moved under them. "I used to wonder what it'd feel like," she said. "To belong somewhere, to someone." Jacob didn't turn to look at her. "You don't have to wonder anymore," he said. The trail grew narrow as they climbed, hemmed by ragged rock and wind-stunted trees. The pass Ruth had mentioned cut between two hills, and by the time they reached its crest, the afternoon light was slanting hard and low, gilding the tops of the lodgepoles below. Maribeth shifted behind Jacob, her arms around his waist looser now, more certain. When he stopped the horse to let it drink from a shallow stream, she slid off without waiting for his hand. He watched her kneel beside the water, dipping her fingers in and rubbing them together like she was testing what the land felt like this far west. "How much farther?" she asked without looking up. "Maybe 5 miles, give or take." She nodded, brushing her palms dry on her skirt. "I should be nervous. You don't seem it." "I think I was before. Now I just feel like I've already arrived somewhere." He dismounted, letting the reins fall slack. "You have." She turned at that, her eyes steady. "I want to ask you something." "All right. If I find work there and you ride on, would you come back?" His answer didn't come quick. He stepped down to the creek's edge, looked out past the ridgeline where the valley opened wide, and then turned back to her. "I wouldn't leave without asking if you wanted me to stay." She rose, brushing dust from her dress. "And if I did, I'd build something solid, with you. Whatever shape it took." They made camp just beyond the pass, where the trees thickened and the wind died down. Jacob gathered fallen branches while Maribeth strung a line between 2 trunks and hung her damp kerchief to dry. Neither of them spoke much, but the quiet didn't stretch thin. It held weight, intention. Once the fire was set and the coffee heating, Maribeth sat with her knees drawn up, watching the flames through lashes thick with dust and ash. "I used to read by the kitchen lamp after chores," she said. "Cookbooks, mostly. Not because I liked them, but because they were what we had. I used to imagine I'd open a place of my own, serve stew and biscuits to folks passing through. Nothing fancy, just clean and warm." Jacob poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "You still want that?" She took it, nodding once. "I'd settle for a stove that burns even and a roof that doesn't leak." He sipped slow, his eyes on her face. "I could help you build it." She looked up, her fingers curling around the tin. "You'd trade the trail for a hearth." "I'd trade it for a reason to stay." She stared at him a long time, then reached into the satchel beside her and pulled out a small, folded square of cloth. She passed it to him without a word. He unfolded it. A handkerchief, stitched clumsily with maroon thread. A sprig of something meant to be wild sage, though the lines wavered. "I made it when I was 13. Thought I'd give it to the man I married." Jacob's jaw shifted, but he didn't speak. "You don't have to carry it," she said. "But I wanted you to have it." He folded it again, careful as if it were glass, and tucked it inside his coat. "I'll keep it close." That night, she laid her head against his chest beneath the blanket he'd first offered her. The fire burned low and no words passed between them, but her breath warmed the hollow beneath his collarbone, and his arm curved naturally around her back. In the morning, frost rimmed the ground, but neither of them noticed. They rode into Deer Lodge just as the sun broke the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the road. Jacob slowed the horse as the first buildings came into view, modest wooden structures with smoke drifting from chimneys, and the clink of iron from a smithy farther down. Maribeth leaned forward slightly, her chin near his shoulder. "There it is," she murmured. He turned just enough to glance back at her. "You think it'll suit?" She nodded. "I think we will." He dismounted in front of the boarding house, helped her down, and stood beside her as she looked up at the whitewashed walls. She didn't move right away. Just stood there, the morning wind tugging at her skirt. Then she turned toward him. "I'll take the room if you'll stay for supper." "I'll stay," he said without hesitation. "And not just for the meal." She reached for his hand, and this time she laced her fingers through his. He didn't let go. Jacob stepped inside the boarding house just ahead of Maribeth. The air was thick with the scent of lye soap, boiled oats, and pipe smoke faint on the walls. A tall woman with silver hair pinned in a tight coil looked up from behind a desk made of rough pine. "You'll be wanting a room," she said, nodding toward Maribeth. "And you'll be wanting to see about supper," she added, glancing at Jacob. Maribeth folded her hands together. "Yes, ma'am. I was told there might be work here as well. You serve, clean, or cook?" "I can do all three," she said. "Well enough to keep a roof overhead." The woman studied her a moment, then tilted her head toward the corridor. "Room's yours if you want it. There's a bit of washing needs doing and stew to stir. You make yourself useful. We won't talk money till Sunday." Maribeth gave a quiet nod. "That suits me." Jacob waited outside while she followed the woman down a narrow hall. He didn't go far, just leaned against the porch post and watched the street settle into its evening hush. A man led a swayback mule toward the livery, and two girls in wool shawls skipped past with a bucket swinging between them. When she returned, her sleeves were rolled, and her cheeks had taken on a faint flush. She stopped beside him and looked out at the coming dusk. "I've a key now," she said, "and a basin to scrub, but I told her I'd take supper with you first." He offered her his arm. "There's a cafe half a block down. Doesn't look like much, but the bread's always warm." She looped her hand through his elbow, and they walked slow, past the blacksmith's and a saddle shop and a schoolhouse with its windows dark. Inside the cafe, the tables were plain, the floor swept clean enough to smell of cedar. A boy with freckles brought them roasted chicken and boiled carrots, and Jacob poured water from a crock jug into tin cups. They ate in comfortable quiet, the kind that felt less like absence and more like knowing what didn't need saying. Midway through the meal, Maribeth set her fork aside. "I never asked what kind of work you do," she said. "I move letters mostly, sometimes goods. Folks pay to get things where they need going. You ever think about stopping?" "I have." Her eyes met his. "What would it take to make you stay?" He didn't pause. "A reason that doesn't leave." She looked down at her plate, then back up at him. "Then I think you've got one." They walked back under a sky turning soft with stars. The boarding house windows glowed gentle yellow, and the lamplight from the general store spilled onto the boardwalk. At the porch steps, she turned to him. "Would you come inside?" He touched the brim of his hat. "If you want me to, I do." The room was small but clean. A single bed tucked against the far wall, a wash basin, a wooden chair, and a window that opened toward the hills. She lit the lamp and turned to face him, her hands smooth at her sides. "I've never had someone ask what I wanted," she said. "You've got someone now." She stepped forward slow and laid her hand against his chest. "I want a life that's steady. I want to wake up and know what each morning smells like. I want to build something that doesn't get taken." He rested his hand over hers. "Then that's what we'll have." Their kiss wasn't hurried. It wasn't sharp or burning. It was the kind that settled deep, like rain soaking into dry ground. He stayed that night, and in the morning, before the sun had lifted, they went down to the church and sat with the preacher. There were no guests, no fine clothes, no lace. Just her hands in his and vows spoken in voices that didn't shake. Afterward, Maribeth walked with Jacob to the edge of town. He pointed to a plot of land just past the creek bend, where the soil looked dark and the ground stayed dry. "Think this'll grow anything?" he asked. She looked at the slope, the way it caught the sun. "I think it'll grow fine." He built the cabin with his own hands, and she helped raise the walls. They planted cabbages and beans, and she kept chickens behind a fence of split rails. Jacob took work hauling freight between Butte and Missoula, but always rode home by week's end. They never spoke of the trail behind them, not because it hurt, but because they'd carried from it what mattered. At night, she stitched new cloth for the table while he whittled a row of pegs for the wall. And when winter came, they sat by the fire and listened to the wind without fear. One morning, as the snow melted and the creek rose high, she stood in the doorway, hand resting on the swell beneath her apron. "You think we'll have a boy or a girl?" she asked. Jacob came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "I think we'll have someone who'll never need to wonder if they're loved." She leaned back into him, smiling, and the world outside softened, as if it too had found peace.